speaking of the advocacy that the BTIA does on behalf of its members, you've made quite a few. The association has made quite a few suggestions just in this past year alone. And I want to talk a bit about those. One of them has been looking at financing, because where some properties are able to get some business, as you rightly noted earlier on, some have not opened, smaller businesses have not been able to offer their services, and so you have spoken about being able to have some line of credit open for them to be able to access. Tell us about the update on that particular point.
Well, the main areas that we focused on were certainly DFC and Beltrade as well. Mm-hmm. Both of those programs have been successful to a point. Dozens of businesses have accessed loans, large loans, medium-sized, small loans, and grants in the case of Beltrade. I think where it could have gone a little better is these institutions were not necessarily geared to this kind of sudden emergency lending. Mm-hmm. And all the procedures that you go through when you, for example, when you try and get a DFC loan, it's very complicated. There's a lot of paperwork. There are collateral issues. So the main thing we're hearing from those people who applied for loans and either didn't get them or dropped out midway through the process, they either didn't have sufficient land collateral, for example, or the banks that they were borrowing from already had their assets tied up as collateral and were reluctant to let the DFC or Beltrade, let's say, take a second mortgage. So these are details that we would certainly like to see the path to successful borrowing be made simpler. We also, of course, we'd like to see a greater level of funding at lower interest rates be available. But on the other side, I think one thing that the lending programs did, they presented a competitive alternative to the commercial banks. And I think in some cases, the fact that you could apply for a 6% DFC loan made the private banks become a little more liberal in terms of the amounts they would lend and the interest rates that they would charge. So I think in balance, it was both of these programs were good, and we'd like to see them continue, but perhaps be a little bit more liberalized, because it really is survival that many businesses are talking about.
Well, from a commercial perspective, I note that the IDB Invest has also forwarded monies through the Atlantic Bank, for instance, for medium and small enterprises within the tourism industry. So maybe that too is a plus in terms of stakeholders accessing funding?
I would hope so. Again, each business faces its own problems in a different way. Businesses that are heavily leveraged, that owe a lot of money to banks or other institutions, have to behave a little bit differently than operations that are much less in debt. But certainly the only way we're going to get out of this, and you've heard me say it a million times, is that you can't have tourism without tourists.
Yeah.
And so we've got to focus on that issue. How do we get more tourists into Belize? Yeah. One thing we've certainly been working with the ministry and BTB on is further simplify and relax the entry requirements for tourists to come into the country.